how popular David is, because I often say in the left we don't really have the problem of being overcrowded for events. We tend to have the opposite effect. So I'm really excited to be here with you guys today. This is an awesome turnout, and I know David's really excited for all of you guys to join him for his book launch. And just so you know who we are, my name's Faria. I'm a migrant justice organizer with Known as Legal and Health for All, and have had the pleasure of knowing David for many years now.
And I'm Alan. I teach at Ryerson, and I'm active with the New Socialists and with the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly and with Faculty for Palestine. I've been a friend, a comrade, and I've learned from David since the early 1980s, and so it's a real honor to be here to talk about this book. And so thank you, it's great to see all of you here. The launch of this book, Monsters of the Market. And I'm going to just briefly let people know that this book was awarded the prestigious Isaac and Tamara Deutscher Prize. This was awarded this November, like last month, in England. And I'm just going to say a little bit about the prize in case people don't know about it. It's named after Isaac and Tamara Deutscher, who in their own work as activists and as scholars were a model in many ways of sustaining independent, critical, socialist analysis against a stream of bureaucratic top-down models, and particularly of Stalinism at its heights, both in our movements and in terms of geopolitical power. Despite the strength of Stalinism and its power at the time, they continued to carry on a vital tradition of rethinking Marxism, using it in a vibrant way, remembering about power from below, and so on. And in the memory of their extraordinary work, this prize was dedicated. And it's been offered since 1969, and it's very fitting, given David's own heretical Marxism, given his incredible lifelong contribution, and especially the contribution of this book and its rich analysis of the cultural resources used to understand the horrors of capitalism by people in different ways over time. David now joins the prize winners, who include such esteemed Marxist thinkers as David Harvey, Ellen Wood, Eric Hobsbawm, Barbara Taylor, Mike Davis, Terry Eagleton, and last year, Himani Bannerji. So congratulations, David. It's wonderful that you've won that. And extremely fitting that that book won that prize. So now it's my honor to introduce the first speaker for today, Himani Bannerji. Himani, as many of you probably know, and I just want to make sure, is a leading anti-racist feminist Marxist scholar. Her books, Inventing Subjects, Studies in Hegemony, Patriarchy and Colonialism, Dark Side of the Nation, Essays on Multiculturalism, Nationalism and Racism, Thinking Through Essays in Marxism, Feminism and Anti-Racism, and others, have had a deep influence, I think, on many of us in this room, and certainly on me, teaching us to think differently, teaching us to think more richly, challenging us to think against ourselves in different ways. She's one of the 5 scholar activists who David mentions in the acknowledgements as having helped shape his work on Monsters in the Market. So she's been a direct influence on David and on this work itself. And in my view, one of the highest tributes I could pay to Himani is that this week in my office, a student came to visit me, a young woman of color, who was talking about some of the struggles that she's faced in the classroom, and talked about the power of Himani's work in terms of her figuring out her situation in the classroom. And to me, there's no greater tribute to the work of a scholar activist like Himani than that this young woman could find tools to help understand her own situation and do something about it, to recognize the racializing and gendered dynamics of the classroom through the incredible contribution of Himani Bannerji. So I welcome Himani up to speak.
Well, that was rather overwhelming and rather sudden too. But I'm so happy to be here today, and I want to thank the organizers of this launch and also David for asking me to speak for a few minutes. And I'm not going to do gender, race, and class, and a little waltz with that. But there's enough people in this room to start a movement tonight, right away, and move out from this room after the launch to do what the book wants us to do. And of course, we must remember David's other book, without which I couldn't teach my classes. Another World is Possible. So this book that has come now, The Monsters of the Market, tells us in a more detailed way how to look at and make possible another world, and what we can do to change it. And it's true that when I saw this book, it brought to me the memories of long afternoons at now defunct Dooney's Cafe, where most of us spent 2/3 of our summer afternoons, where we talked a lot about rather lowbrow literature, like detective novels and thrillers, and I do remember we talked quite a bit about vampires and monsters, but I don't quite remember the zombies. I'm not still with them. I mean, I don't follow the zombie cult as well as I just saw Pride and Prejudice with a zombie, but that's the only thing I know. So I'm really happy to be here, and I'm also very happy that David has this prize, the Deutscher Award, which is renowned all over the world for having gone to activists who not just interpret the world, scholars, but who want to change it. So it's a very special kind of a prize, and I think that it's really only fitting after years of work that David has done, making very difficult things easy for us to understand in his various books on the market, on capitalism. And I don't know what I would do without the global slump, which explains to my class, for example, what's happened or is going on with finance capital. It's not something I understand well, but I don't have investments, so I'm not worried about that part. But so the Deutscher Award is a really great thing. I've read many writers who have received Deutscher Award, but I've never known any of them to be a friend, to be a comrade, to be my colleague, and someone I'm really very fond of. And I think even the left is allowed personal feelings at times. So I have a lot of personal feelings. And two things I want to just point out. It's not a time for having a big, heavy discussion, but I was so happy that this book taught the economists how to think about the world like in a more normal, everyday way. Because the economists sort of live in a bubble, and they have their own language, even Marxist economists, and who don't see that Marx's work is not economistic, but it's social. And I think what David has done is brought that, gone across boundaries and brought in, and broken the barrier between high culture and low culture, and brought in this incredible interpretation of Marx's work, alienation, reification, and capital's own organization, and explained it in ways in which people can relate to it who don't call themselves and are not part of so-called left intelligentsia. So I'm really happy that this book makes it accessible. It could do with more illustrations and, I think, comics. So that having said, it's crossed the boundaries and done this work without really wearing a badge of what is now sold as interdisciplinarity in the university. So that's very good. And the other thing I really liked about this book is also that it's brought in the everyday world we live in really such ways that if we are going to look where capital lies, what capital is, if it is not an abstraction, there's nowhere we don't have to look to understand that. And he brought in and actually in the best way demonstrated what this group is trying to do on historical materialism, how material and historical culture is and how politics and culture are connected. And so having said that and express my gratefulness to David for the work he's done and how he has pointed this way to looking at everything, nothing being negligible in its signifying capacity, its expressive and making capacity of making capital a real living force in our life, but also by inverting some of the notions that of monstrosity and other kinds of horrors into the horrors of capital, not just the marginals to capital. So the book is truly double-edged and achieves a very interesting result by showing us how to look at it front to back and how to use resistance, make resistance out of found material on the street everywhere. And I think in that David's work, his beautiful writing, almost poetic, reminds me of the work of one of the most intelligent artist of our last century, Bertolt Brecht. So having said that, and reminding us of the shark that has fine teeth, and the bandit McKeith whose knife never shows, and this absent presence of the killer, the crime novel of capital, the horror story of capital, and its resistance has come to us through the monsters of the market. So please buy this book, celebrate it, give it as Christmas presents in a contradictory manner, and have a good time. Thank you.
David really reminded me of a rapper. And I know that sounds crazy because here's this white middle-aged man, he's really unassuming, he wears his plaid shirts, all of that. But he's a phenomenal storyteller, and that's what rappers are. They're lyrical geniuses, and that's actually to me what David most profoundly represents, because he narrates stories. He takes this oppressive system and he tells you the story. He tells you the good versus bad. He tells you, what we value, what we fight for, why we love and fight so hard. And I think ultimately that's what actually makes you the most powerful in terms of both a speaker and an author. And that's what helps you to actually convey those ideas is through these narrations. And I think David does that beautifully. So here's David.
No, there's no way I can live up to any of this. And this is, the inherent problem always of having kind and generous friends who get up and say, just impossibly inflated things about you. And you can't possibly deliver the goods after they do that. So I'm just going to improvise as best that I can. Obviously, I want to thank from the heart both Faria and Alan, who agreed to MC this event for me. I cannot believe that Faria got you to chant book launch. That's unprecedented in my experience. I must thank Himani, my dear friend over so many years, who I think probably shares the deepest appreciation of how much literature has been a part of my life, and as she says, the hours we have spent sitting in cafes talking about everything from mystery novels to the more highfalutin stuff that we're supposed to read has just been a treasure. And then Colin, of course, who manages somehow to relate a dedication to my son Liam to the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. I mean, that's creative work, my friend, and much appreciated. Now, I'm going to thank some other people in a moment, but I do want to also tell you that there's a little bit of a sense of vindication with this book, Monsters of the Market, because it, in some ways, was the runt of the litter. I have never had so much trouble publishing a book. This book was rejected by 2 progressive publishers both of whom had great rave reviews, and they got cold feet each time, and they backed off, and in one case, actually broke a contract with me. So I can't help but feel a little bit of vindication that this book, in particular, has actually won a little bit of recognition. But I must tell you, that, it's been a hard sell, even with many people very, very close to me. So I'm going to say a little bit about my larger extended family, some of which is here tonight in this context. So, but I really want to acknowledge and appreciate that my mom Helen is here, my father John, my stepmom Marilyn, my sisters Terry and Sandra, my brother Stephen and his partner Renee, my sister in common law Anne is here, my common law, not hers. And, I'll say something about a couple of closer people in a moment, but some of them have been utterly incredulous about this book. I'm convinced that my father believes that this whole event tonight is a put-up. Because every time for the last 2 years, he asked me what I was working on, and I told him it's a book called Monsters of the Market, Zombies, Vampires, and Global Capitalism. He burst out laughing. Completely refused to believe it, and I think, now he's just probably convinced that I just am not going to back down on this story. My mother, on the other hand, more easily bought into it, but then called me the other day and said, I'm coming to your book launch, dear, and now what's the name of the book again? Wizards. Now, if that's not bad enough, I had a very distinguished historian email me yesterday to say, sorry, I can't make your book launch, I'm leaving for England, but I really do plan to read Vampire Nation. Maybe it's a good choice. I have no idea. But, so, I appreciate that Faria tried to get you to actually say the name of the book, because obviously some people have been having trouble with it all along. I want also to pay some tribute here to the activist community that's always a part of the work that I do, and frankly, that keeps me inspired, that keeps me energized, and their constant organizing and activism in the trenches, day in and day out, around migrant justice, anti-poverty work, solidarity with Palestine, and so on, is really, frankly, it's what in the end all this is about. So I do want to acknowledge the amazing work and the activists here tonight from the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty, Coalition Against Israeli Apartheid, the New Socialist Group, No One is Illegal Toronto, the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly, the Ontario Public Interest Research Group at York and U of T, and the Historical Materialism Toronto Group. They're just wonderful people, great activists and organizers, and frankly, they enrich all my work and everything that I do. You've heard about Liam, and you've seen him on screen 2 years ago, bemoaning the fact that he was the only member of his family that didn't yet have a book dedicated to him. My only concern is Liam, by the way, has been at the cash table all night and really been into the business side of selling books. And so I'm a little concerned that he's not quite drawing the right lesson from all of this, but we'll talk about it afterwards. And last but by no means least, it's really important for me to acknowledge Sue Ferguson, my partner in romance, child rearing, politics, scholarly writing, and other unmentionable things. And frankly, Sue is the person who has more shared all of the writing and thinking and activism that I do than anybody else in my life. And if it wasn't dedicated to Liam, she'd certainly have a good claim for it. It's really important to me to acknowledge Sue and her love and support through this book and all the work that I do. I've also discovered in the course of speaking about this book that people really come out of the closets and crypts. You wouldn't believe the number of people who are deeply, often slightly secretively, and sometimes a little shamefully, really invested in zombies and vampires. I have received so many references to novels I have to read, graphic novels I have to check out, movies I must see, television series that lasted for 5 episodes, but I've got to get on the web and track them down and look at them. And then, of course, and you know who you are, there are the people who know the script for every Buffy the Vampire Slayer episode. I mean, they will come up to you after these sessions and they'll start interrogating you. Isn't season 3, episode 1, the best treatment of work under capitalism ever? By the way, it is pretty good. And I've also discovered that there are hardcore vampire people and hardcore zombie people. And they don't necessarily like one another. And they don't necessarily like one another's cultural preferences. And so, wading into this area, I discovered to be much more fraught and contested than I might have expected. On the other hand, it may be appropriate to the kind of work that I do. More than anything else, what drew me to this book was a growing fascination with a variety of cultural forms in late capitalism. It seemed to me that very often on the left, we do great work explaining how the system works, how it reproduces poverty and unemployment, and we forget that, in fact, a whole range of ways in which people experience modern society is deeply mediated, formed, and shaped by the cultural terrain and the cultural practices that are inherently part of everyday life. And I became intrigued by some of those cultural forms and wanted to make some kind of sense of them. And frankly, this was really one of those joys of discovery in which I began this work with what now forms Chapter 3, African Vampires in the Age of Globalization. And it was only in the course of working on contemporary zombie and vampire stories in sub-Saharan Africa that I began to intuit a whole series of really interesting connections to the really foundational monster story of capitalism, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And so I worked back actually in historical time and across historical time and place. But along the way, I was always so struck by the way in which these cultural forms are deeply invested both with fears and anxieties, but also with hopes and dreams. I'm going to come back to that in the last few minutes of my remarks. I'm going to just read you a couple of brief passages from the book, and then I'm going to read a couple of things that aren't in the book, but that I thought if I got inspired, I might decide to share with you. And, what can I say? This crowd and the mood in this room, I'm inspired. So I will actually read a couple of things that I wasn't sure if I would. These first couple of passages I'm going to read to you come from the introduction. No great investigative rigors are required to discover zombies and vampires marauding across movie and television screens, or haunting the pages of pulp fiction. Tales of body snatching, of abduction, ritual murder, and organ theft transverse folklore, science fiction, film, video, and print media. As with all such cultural phenomena, these stories and legends speak to real social practices and to the symbolic registers in which popular anxieties are recorded. After all, organ selling is in fact a growing industry based on commercial clinics that harvest parts like kidneys from poor people in the global south on behalf of wealthy buyers in the north. Here then we have monstrosities of the market enacted in actual exchanges of body parts for money. But the revulsion elicited by such transactions often includes the much wider range of monstrous experiences, beginning with the everyday sale of our life energies for a wage that define life in capitalist society. And that, by the way, is probably the most unifying theme across this book. That is to say, how monstrous people experience, particularly their initial historical subjection to labor markets. How foreign, bizarre, and frightening is the idea that people forced off the land, dispossessed of any other means of life, have to sell themselves, their bodies and their laboring capacities, to someone else who owns them for that period of time in order to stay alive. And that, what we take so for granted today, that essential and fundamental feature of capitalism, I suggest, inspires and elicits horror in a whole series of registers from people. Nowhere in the discourse of monstrosity today do we find the naming of capitalism as a monstrous system, one that systematically threatens the integrity of human personhood. Instead, monsters like vampires and zombies move through the circuits of cultural exchange, largely detached from the system that gives them their life-threatening energies. One purpose of this book is to bring the monsters of the market out of this netherworld by exploring the zones of experience that nurture and sustain them, that provide them the blood and flesh off which they feed. Central to this exploration is the claim that tales of body snatching, vampirism, organ theft, and zombie economics all comprise multiple imaginings of the risks to bodily integrity that inhere in a society in which individual survival requires selling our life energies to others on the market. Body panics are thus, I submit, cultural phenomena endemic to capitalism, part of the phenomenology of bourgeois life. I then go on to talk about some of these historical monsters, and one point that I'll just quickly make for you, because to me it became so resonant with what is happening in late capitalism, was to really begin to understand and appreciate the Haitian roots of the zombie. That Haiti is the site for the original historical cultural production of the zombie, drawing upon West African imagery, but in particular during a period of US occupation in which forced labor was imposed upon tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Haitians by the US military. The zombie image really took life, and what was central to it was the idea of the zombie laborer. The idea of the living dead beasts of burden without identity, memory, subjectivity, self-consciousness, who labor to enrich others. And that Haitian image of the zombie, I submit, is more powerfully invested with critical power, with really great critical shock value than any others. And it's an indication of what has happened culturally, that in Hollywood in recent decades, zombies are no longer predominantly laborers, but increasingly manic consumers. That they're people out to eat you. They're out to devour your flesh. Think of The Walking Dead, for those of you in the room who don't watch such lowbrow stuff. The Haitian image, I suggest, carries an enormous critical charge, and it has today, in a certain sense, been resurrected. It has been reborn in sub-Saharan Africa, and as a result, the third chapter of the book is really devoted to the zombie and vampire stories that can be found in sub-Saharan Africa today, and I'll just give you a quick bit of what I have to say in the introduction about that. In Nigeria today, newspapers carry reports of passengers on motorcycle taxis who, once helmets are placed on their heads, mysteriously transform into zombies that spew money from their mouths. into human ATMs. From Cameroon, Tanzania, South Africa, and elsewhere come stories of witches who, rather than devouring their victims, as in older witchcraft genres, turn them into zombie laborers on invisible plantations in an obscure nocturnal economy. And in all of these countries, there is an epidemic of stories of dismemberment and murder for the purpose of harvesting body parts, which can be used in magic potions that guarantee enrichment, or can be sold as commodities for the same purpose. Mainstream social science has a long tradition of characterizing such tales as pre-modern superstitions. Yet such dismissals enact a mystification, denying as they do the systematic assaults on bodily and psychic integrity that define the economic infrastructure of modernity, the capitalist market system. And that is why we need disruptive fables of modernity like those circulating through sub-Saharan Africa today, for such tales disturb the naturalization of capitalism, both of its social relations and the senses of property, propriety, and personhood that accompany it, by insisting that something strange, indeed life-threatening, is at work in our world. And Himani mentioned Bertolt Brecht. I won't even presume for a moment to suggest that this book or anything else I've written deserves to be mentioned in the same breath as Brecht. That was very flattering of Himani. But Brecht, of course, felt that the key challenge for epic theater was to alienate us from the everyday, to make us understand and to see and to grasp that what appears as normal and natural is deeply strange, bizarre, disquieting, and unsettling. And my submission in the book is that we can learn an enormous amount from both the Haitian version of the zombie and as well of the sub-Saharan African tales and fables and folklore of zombies and vampires today. I devote a fair bit of time to then relating the zombie and the vampire to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and then come to Marx, who comprises the middle chapter of the book, a chapter called Marx's Monsters, Vampire Capital and the Nightmare World of Late Capitalism. And I'll just share with you one paragraph. Part of the genius of Karl Marx is to have intuited something of this plebeian culture, that is, the plebeian culture that Mary Shelley captures in Frankenstein, and to have mobilized it for critical purpose in his monumental analysis of the capitalist system. Numerous commentators have noted Marx's propensity to enlist images of monsters to depict how capitalism operates, describing the way in which it expands by appropriating the unpaid labor of workers. Marx writes that, quote, "Capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor." Elsewhere, he describes capital's werewolf-like hunger for surplus labor and his vampire thirst for the living blood of labor. Typically, formulations of this sort are seen as mere rhetorical flourishes. Rarely has their strategic, theoretical purpose been divined, nor its connection to the theme of corporeal dismemberment. As Marx searched for a means of depicting the actual horrors of capitalism, from child labor to the extermination of North America's indigenous peoples, from the factory system to the slave trade, he reworked the discourse of monstrosity that emerged with the rise of capitalism. Pillaging popular and literary imagination, from vampire tales to Goethe's Faust, he cast capitalism as both a modern horror story and a mystery tale, each inexplicable outside the language of monstrosity. And I think if there's anything that I want to contribute by way of anything original in my reading of Marx in this book, it is in some ways to reclaim Marx in very much the sense that Faria talked about, as a storyteller. And a storyteller who invested his stories of what was happening with children in the factories and the mines, what was happening with the transatlantic slave trade, what was happening with what he calls the extirpation and entombment of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, as central to his craft of telling the story of what capitalism is. And that's going to bring me now to sharing with you excerpts, very briefly, from two writers who figure in this book. first couple of passages I'm going to read you come from Leslie Marmon Silko, and she's an Indigenous American writer, in her wonderful and just absolutely mind-blowing book, Almanac of the Dead. And she has a chapter called Vampire Capitalists. And I'm just going to read you a few passages because, frankly, they were incredibly important to me in thinking about how I was going to write this book. And in Almanac of the Dead, Silko describes the experience of an Indigenous woman in the United States encountering Marx's work. And she writes, Marx was the first white man she had ever heard call his own people vampires and monsters. But Marx had not stopped with accusations. Marx had caught the capitalists of the British Empire with bloody hands. Marx backed every assertion with evidence, coroner's reports with gruesome stories about giant spinning machines that consumed the limbs and the lives of the small children in factories. On and on Marx went, describing the tiny corpses of children who had been worked to death, their deformed bodies shaped to fit inside factory machinery and other cramped spaces. Tribal people had had all the experience they would ever need to judge whether Marx's stories told the truth. The Indians had seen generations of themselves ground into bloody pulp under the steel wheels of ore cars in crumbling tunnels of gold mines. The Indians had seen for themselves the cruelty of the Europeans towards children and women. That was how she had satisfied herself Marx was reliable. His accounts had been consistent with what the people already knew. In the Americas, I'm going to skip that one because I don't want to take too much time. Marx had never forgotten the indigenous people of the Americas or of Africa. Marx had recited the crimes of slaughter and slavery committed by the European colonials who had been sent by their capitalist slave masters to secure the raw materials of capitalism, human flesh and blood. This man Marx had understood that the stories or histories are sacred, that within history reside relentless forces, powerful spirits, vengeful, relentlessly seeking justice. And it's that spirit that I try to end the book on, pointing out that one of the things that monster tales also hold out is that moment, that possibility that the zombies themselves might awaken, that they might reclaim their humanity, that they might recover memory, identity, subjectivity, and self-consciousness, that they might, as they do in overly sanitized scenes occasionally in zombie films, run havoc through the streets, turning polite, genteel, bourgeois society upside down. And that, of course, is the imagery of Monster Rebellion, which is the moment on which I close the book. And because I know there are a couple of you in the room who share my love for jazz, I will tell you that Thelonious Monk figures precisely in that final chapter because he was the one great jazz artist of this period whose music was regularly referred to as zombie music. Now, I'm going to close by reading for you from a text that doesn't figure in the book, but the last great writer that I deal with in chapter 3 on African vampires in the age of globalization is the mind-blowing Nigerian novelist Ben Okri. And Okri's Famished Road trilogy, I argue, reworks vampire and zombie tropes into the most amazing account of post-colonial capitalism in sub-Saharan Africa today. Okri has written a volume of poetry called Mental Fight. And Mental Fight is a direct tribute to William Blake, who uses the term in one of his most amazing poems. And I want to finish by reading you a lengthy excerpt from, by the way, one of my great pleasures in having written this book has been that several people have contacted me to say, I'm now reading Ben Okri's Famished Road trilogy thanks to reading your book. And, frankly, Okri sold way more books than I will ever sell. He's won the Booker Prize and so on. But to turn anybody on to his amazing work is fantastic. So this comes from Ben Okri's Mental Fight. And it's a poem that's in the middle. And for me, it's important because, as Himani said, we have enough people here tonight to start a small movement. And for me, one of the key things all of us struggle against in this horrible neoliberal age is a sense of exhaustion. The sense of energies being worn out and ground down, that standing up for migrant justice, organizing against poverty, fighting for Palestinian liberation, and so on, is taxing, demanding, grinding, and often we feel like we're up against everything. And so Okri has, for me, one of the great poetic responses to this problem. And he writes, "Is time exhausted? No, time is yet young, and has timeless millennia ahead, way beyond our furthest dreams. Is nature exhausted? Ask the oak trees, the hollies, the flowers, birds, fishes, and lions. They will continue for as long as the earth allows them. Is humanity exhausted? Individuals are, nations are, some civilizations are becoming so, but humanity isn't. The hungry nations are hungry still. The starving people dream of food. The unfree fight for freedom. The oppressed plan for liberation. The small scheme for might. The invisible prepare for higher visibility. They are only exhausted who think they are. They are only exhausted who no longer have a reason to strive and dream and hope. They are only exhausted who think that they have arrived at their final destination, the end of their road, with all of their dreams achieved, and with no new dreams to hold. The exhausted are those who have come to the end of their powers of imagination, who have limited their possibilities, who have thought themselves into the dead ends that they call the highest points of their civilizations. Those who are exhausted have lost the greater picture, the greater perspective. They are trapped in their own labyrinth, their lovelessness, selfishness. For those with limited dreams, there is chaos to come, disintegration, nightmares. I hear them talk about the end of history, but those of us who haven't tasted the best fruits of time yet, to whom history has been harsh, we think differently. We know that history is all there to be made in the future. Exhaustion is a mental thing, the absence of a spiritual viewpoint, a universal vision, a sense of new journeys, higher discoveries. There is no exhaustion where there is much to be hoped for, much to work towards, and where the dreams and sufferings of our ancestors have not been realized or redeemed. There is no exhaustion when you can still visualize a better life for those who suffer. Visualize universal justice, a leavening of the great dough of humanity, uplifting the multitudes. But when you can no longer dream, no longer see possibilities, no longer see alternatives, when you can only see limitation, only despair and negation, then you are in the way. You are also the problem. The exhausted obstruct the creation of a greater future. The exhausted should therefore clear the stage for new dreamers, for warriors of love, justice, and enlightenment. And although the book is dedicated, quite rightly, to Liam, frankly, I would like to think that it is also Monsters of the Market dedicated to those new dreamers, for warriors of love, justice, and enlightenment. Thank you very much.